I did not say that. I filed it instead, the way I filed every apex predator my species had ever catalogued, because on Sisval, fear of the correct things was not weakness. It was the entire foundation of staying alive long enough to have descendants. I was 300 meters beneath the surface of the Sisval Trench Reach, negotiating breach terms with a Threll void serpent that had drifted into our outer trade lanes, a creature capable of consuming a mid-sized freighter whole. One of 11 such negotiations I had personally concluded across my career without loss of vessel or crew, when the reassignment order reached me through my depth relay. I was Coratholan, of the deep ocean world of Sisval, apex threat consultant to the Compact, and in 164 cycles of service, I had personally catalogued and negotiated containment terms with every apex predator species known to the charted reach. My homeworld's oceans were themselves lethal beyond most Deathworld classifications, 3 moons pulling triple tides across trench cities built into basalt canyon walls, bioluminescent hunters the size of small moons drifting through waters so deep that light itself gave up before reaching bottom. My people survived it by building an entire civilization around one organizing principle: absolute, unshakable respect for what could kill us. Respect correctly calibrated was the only technology that mattered. I did not carry a visible wound the way Deathworlder cultures counted cost in scar tissue. I carried mine in the pressure scarring across both gill ridges, a permanent ripple in the tissue left by a juvenile encounter with a Sval depth hunter that had come within a body length of ending my life before I understood what fear was for. I kept the scarring unrepaired. Every apprentice I trained touched it once, early in their instruction, so they would understand that respect for a predator was never optional and never fully earned. It was renewed daily, or it failed you exactly once. Consultation Liaison Vrek found me finishing the Void Serpent terms. New candidate world flagged for consultation. Designation: human. Survey drones logged an encounter between a human and a native apex predator that they could not classify. Com of the encounter: the human is uninjured. The predator retreated without pressing the engagement. The drones flagged the human's behavioral response during the encounter as inconsistent with every predator response model currently in Compact records. In 164 cycles, I had never once seen a predator response anomaly logged against the survivor rather than the predator. Every prior anomaly I had assessed involved a predator behaving outside expected parameters, never the prey. I logged the irregularity with genuine curiosity, not alarm, and diverted a survey vessel toward the assignment, expecting to find a straightforward classification error in the drone's behavioral matrix. I brought 2 consultants with me. Desk, a predator behavior specialist whose confidence in threat response modeling bordered on doctrine itself, and Oren, junior enough in her training that she still occasionally found the models incomplete rather than simply correct, a trait I had begun quietly to value in her above her more compliant peers. The human world's provisional file described a marine apex predator native to their temperate coastal waters, a species our preliminary scans classified as moderately dangerous by Galactic standard, well below the threat tier of anything I had personally negotiated with across my career. By every metric my consultation used, this should have resolved within hours as a minor drone miscalibration. We settled our vessel in cloaked orbit above a rugged coastal fishing region, and I began the standard threat response sweep that should have concluded the matter before the first local sunset. It did not conclude. The first anomalous entry arrived on the second day, and like every entry that followed, it presented itself as something almost too small to warrant formal cataloging. Local surveillance recorded a human male, designation later confirmed as Thomas Bridger, Old Tom, as the fishing community referred to him in recorded conversation, 68 years of age by growth rate approximation, a commercial fisherman working the same coastal waters for what local records suggested was over 4 decades. Bridger, alone on a modest fishing vessel during routine morning operations, was approached by a marine predator, our matrix confirmed capable of significant physical harm, a species responsible, per regional incident records, for 3 documented human injuries within the preceding 2 years. None fatal but all requiring hospitalization. Bridger did not retreat toward shore. He did not deploy any defensive countermeasure our sensors could identify. No deterrent device, no distress signal, nothing our threat response library associated with confirmed predator proximity. What he did instead was strike the water's surface twice with the flat of an oar, and our translation matrix, working from audio picked up by his own vessel's ambient recording equipment, rendered his vocalization as irritated rather than afraid. Approximately, "Not today, you've had quite enough of my catch this week already. Go bother somebody else's nets." The predator circled once, closer than our own threat models would have advised any sentient being to permit, and then departed. Desk ran the threat response model twice, then a third time with adjusted parameters, as though the output itself might change through persistence alone. There is no fear response indicated in his vocal or physiological data. Heart rate elevation is present but consistent with baseline alertness during routine labor, not with confirmed predator proximity. This is a documented threat species, 3 prior human injuries in the regional record. He is aware of the risk. And, if the translation is accurate, mildly inconvenienced by it. Those are not adjacent categories on any threat response scale we maintain. I filed the entry as predator run anomalous and continued the sweep, though something behind my pressure-scarred gill ridges had already begun logging a question that no century and a half of negotiation training had equipped me to answer. The catalog grew across the following days, and it grew in a direction that unsettled Desk more thoroughly with each new entry than any Void Serpent negotiation I had ever conducted in his presence. I observed Bridger repeat variations of the same encounter across 4 separate mornings, a pattern of long, casual, almost contemptuous familiarity with his ocean's most dangerous residents that our matrix could only describe as something bordering on relationship rather than avoidance. He spoke to the water constantly during his working hours, ambient audio filled with a running commentary of grievances directed at no one in particular. The tide running against him, a storm system delaying his route, a fish that had slipped his net at the last possible moment, and, on the 3rd recorded morning, the same predator returning for what Bridger, translated, referred to as round 2. Apparently we're doing this every Tuesday now. He talks to the ocean as though it personally owes him something. Oren observed, watching the 4th day's footage beside me, and I filed the observation without immediately understanding why it disturbed something in my own processing as much as it clearly disturbed hers. The pattern sharpened considerably on the 6th day, when I observed a younger fisherman, designation confirmed as Bridger's occasional deckhand, a man in his 20s still early in his own maritime training, react to the same predator's approach with what our matrix confirmed as textbook, appropriate fear response. Elevated heart rate, immediate retreat toward the vessel's center, hand moving toward a deployed emergency flare. Bridger's response, translated from the recorded exchange. "Save the flare, son. Look at how he's moving. Slow, curious, not hunting. He's not hungry, he's just being nosy." Big difference between nosy and hungry. You'll learn to read it. Took me 20 years. You'll manage it faster if you actually watch, instead of just being scared the whole time. He is teaching a threat discrimination skill our own species requires decades of specialized field training to develop reliably, Desk said. And for the first time since our arrival, I heard something in his voice that was not simply analytical resistance to an unresolved data point. It was closer to disquiet, and he is teaching it the way one might teach a child to read weather, as though it were common, transferable knowledge rather than an elite survival competency. Perhaps on this world, among people who live and work on that water, it is exactly that. I observed, in the days that followed, that Bridger's casual authority over his own fear extended well beyond the predator encounters. Local records confirmed he had, 11 years prior, pulled a capsized recreational boater from open water during a squall that regional weather services had rated hazardous even for experienced commercial vessels. An act his own community apparently considered so unremarkable that it appeared in no formal record beyond a single line in the harbor logbook, and Bridger himself, when questioned by a local journalist compiling a maritime history piece some years later, was recorded dismissing the entire incident. "Wasn't anything. Fella was in trouble. I was closer than the Coast Guard. Anybody would done it." Nobody, by our survey's own cross-referenced regional data, had done it in 3 prior similar incidents involving other vessels. Two of those incidents had ended fatally. He believes his own behavior is unremarkable, Oren said, specifically because he cannot conceive of a version of himself that would have done otherwise. That is not modesty. That is a species that has set its baseline for ordinary courage somewhere our own threat consultation doctrine would classify as exceptional. I filed her assessment without correction because I no longer trusted that I had a correction to offer. The crisis arrived through our own failure, the way it always does, our vessel's containment field. Strained by an extended low-orbit observation cycle that 8 days of increasingly complex behavioral data collection had required well beyond our original survey window. Fractured during a routine repositioning maneuver above the coastal fishing region on the 8th day. Des caught the fault 4 seconds before critical failure. Insufficient time for controlled displacement to open water or unpopulated terrain, the only outcomes our doctrine considered acceptable. We came down hard, cloak failing entirely on impact, roughly 2 kilometers from Bridger's usual fishing grounds. Our hull breaching seawater rapidly through a fracture along the lower containment seam. My own carapace pinned beneath collapsed structural plating that had buckled inward on impact, Oren's communication array crushed and silent, and Desk's lower limbs trapped at an angle that made independent movement structurally impossible without external assistance. Compact protocol was absolute and unambiguous. A vessel suffering catastrophic failure over an uncontacted world executes silent emergency extraction regardless of crew injury, accepting total personnel loss if the alternative is direct contact that could compromise first contact doctrine. I gave the order for silent extraction. It failed immediately. The same fracture that had breached our hull had corrupted our extraction beacon beyond any field repair. Desk's remaining functional limb could attempt, and my own diagnostic readout gave the flooding compartment, at current intake rate, perhaps 9 minutes before the water reached a depth that would end all 3 of us regardless of what happened afterward. I do not fully understand, even now, what made me transmit an open distress signal on an unencrypted frequency, in direct violation of a century and a half of doctrine I had personally enforced against every candidate species my consultation had ever surveyed. Rather than accept the loss silently as protocol required, I told the review tribunal afterward that Oren's crushed array and Desk's trapped limb made silent loss for both of them a certainty rather than merely a probability, and that this justified the breach on medical grounds alone. That was true. It was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that I had spent 8 days watching a man treat his ocean's most lethal residents with irritation rather than terror, watched him pull a drowning stranger from hazardous water and dismiss it as nothing worth remembering, and some part of my pressure-scared, century-and-a-half trained framework had concluded, without my formal authorization, that if my crew was going to drown in open water 2 kilometers off an unfamiliar coast, it should happen as close as possible to the one human on this entire world who did not appear to fear the water itself at all. Tom Bridger's vessel was the nearest working boat to our impact site by a considerable margin. His usual morning route, we would later confirm, ran almost directly across our coordinates. He reached the wreckage within minutes of our beacon transmission, and what crossed his weathered, sun-worn face at the sight of unidentified, unmistakably alien wreckage taking on water in his own fishing grounds was not the fear our matrix had modeled as the statistically probable human response to first contact. It was the same unhurried, faintly irritated, entirely practical assessment he gave every dangerous thing his ocean had ever produced in 4 decades of working it. "Well," he said, translated, already swinging a line toward the breach, voice carrying no more alarm than it had carried facing down a shark 3 days earlier. "That's new. Hang on. I've pulled worse out of worse water than this. Give me a second to figure out where the damage is." He hauled Oren clear first, smallest, most visibly compromised, securing her against his own vessel's rail with a competence that suggested decades of practice, extracting things from water that did not want to give them up, before turning back for Desk, working the trapped limb free with a mechanical patience that never once slowed into panic, despite the rising water level our own sensors confirmed he could not have failed to notice. He found me last, pinned beneath the buckled plating, water at what would have been on a human chest height within the flooding compartment. He did not hesitate at my physiology. The gill ridges, the pressure scarring, nothing in my architecture resembling anything his species' evolutionary history could have prepared him for. He simply assessed the wedged plating the way I understood watching him work. He assessed a tangled net, a problem with a shape, and therefore a problem with a solution, if you were patient enough and refused to let urgency make you clumsy. He said, working a length of pipe under the plating's edge for leverage, breathing hard now but steady. You're not the strangest thing I've hauled out of this water, if you want to know the truth. Give me the angle. There we go. The plating gave. He hauled me clear with a grip that should not, by any tissue density model my own species had ever run on his, have held against my mass under those conditions, and got me across the rail into his vessel beside Orrin and Desk, with water still pouring from the wreckage behind us. It was in that moment, hauled from drowning by a man who had spent 4 decades treating his ocean's every lethal resident with the same weary, practical irritation he might direct at difficult weather, that I understood my pressure scarring had never meant what 164 cycles of consultation doctrine had told me it meant. I had believed it meant I have learned to fear correctly, and correct fear, renewed daily, is the only technology that keeps a species alive in a lethal ocean. Held against Tom Bridger's hands, unhurried, irritated rather than afraid, freeing 3 unidentified alien bodies from wreckage in the same waters that had hospitalized 3 of his neighbors and nearly killed me. I understood the scarring meant something far smaller than I had built a career believing. I had learned to fear what could kill me, precisely, continuously, as an unbroken discipline. He had simply learned to work alongside the things that could kill him, without ever once letting that fear decide what he was and was not willing to do about a stranger in trouble. I did not say any of this to him. I filed it, because filing was the only vocabulary 164 cycles had given me for something this large, and even as he radioed for medical assistance in a local dialect, his equipment barely translated fast enough for me to follow. One hand still steadying Orrin against the vessel's rail, I catalogued the sensation the only way I knew how. Structural realignment, category unresolved, severity, total. The review came 9 days later aboard the recovery vessel. Under a consultation tribunal I had helped establish protocol for decades earlier. Consultation Elder Vashra presided personally, which told me the severity of the breach before she spoke a single formal word. You transmitted an open distress beacon in populated, uncontacted territory, she said. You permitted direct physical rescue and contact from a local sentient. In violation of protocol you yourself have enforced against every candidate species surveyed under your tenure. Do you dispute the record? I do not dispute the record. Then justify your continued position on this transcript alone. I did not read from prepared documentation. 164 cycles of threat consultation vocabulary had given me precise language for containment radius and predator behavioral triggers, and none of it contained the argument I actually needed to make, so I built the case from the catalog instead, and let the evidence carry what the vocabulary could not. Elder Vashra. I have personally negotiated containment terms with every apex predator species known to the charted reach. I know, better than any consultant currently serving, exactly what correct fear looks like, and exactly what it costs a species to maintain it. I have 9 days of continuous observation of a human who has spent 4 decades in direct, repeated proximity to a documented apex predator, who teaches threat discrimination as though it were common knowledge rather than an elite survival skill, who pulled a drowning stranger from hazardous water 11 years ago and considers the act too unremarkable to remember clearly, and who, upon encountering 3 unidentified physiologically alien beings drowning in wreckage in his own fishing grounds, responded with the same unhurried competence. He shows a difficult net, not fever, not hesitation, simply work to be done. I do not have a classification tier for a species capable of that degree of functional, generational coexistence with lethal danger without becoming either reckless or paralyzed. I am not asking this tribunal to feel anything about that. I am asking it to explain, on the evidence, how our entire threat consultation model survives contact with a species that has apparently solved the problem my own homeworld built its civilization around solving, without ever formally naming the solution at all. You are describing one fisherman, Vashra said, though I noted filing it precisely, that her voice had lost the edge with which she had opened the proceeding. Not a species-wide capacity. I am describing a behavior this survey confirmed as unremarkable within his own community, elder, not exceptional, not celebrated. Simply how the people of that coast conduct themselves around danger they have learned to work alongside, rather than merely fear. I have the footage. I do not have full certainty what it means for this world's classification. I am certain only that we fear no predator in the galaxy does not survive contact with a species that appears to have never needed to. The chamber held silent long enough that I believed, filing the silence, that I had achieved nothing at all. Your position is suspended pending formal review, Vashra said finally, not revoked. The classification is logged provisionally as Predator Coexistence Model Reassessment. This consultation has never applied that designation to any surveyed world. It will require extended study before any consultant, present or future, closes this file. It was not vindication. It was a door left open rather than sealed. And I understood, filing the ruling away, that it was more than my breach of doctrine had any right to earn me. I wrote my formal assessment across the following days in the technical language the consultation required. Encounter frequency data, threat discrimination accuracy percentages, cross-referenced incident timestamps. Buried in the final appendix, where doctrine does not require sentiment and therefore will not scrutinize it, I wrote. Subject Thomas Bridger demonstrates sustained, repeated functional proximity to a documented apex predator species across a working lifetime at a threat discrimination accuracy this consultation cannot currently model, accompanied by unremarkable, community-normalized rescue behavior toward both conspecifics and non-conspecifics under hazardous conditions. I cannot certify this species as fear-naive. I cannot certify the mechanism by which they sustain functional courage without our own doctrine's rigorous, continuous discipline of correct fear to explain it. I can certify only that a species capable of working calmly alongside what could kill them, generation after generation, without becoming either careless or afraid to act, cannot remain filed as anything this consultation currently has language for. The report moved up the chain to elders who had never had unhurried, weathered hands pull them from flooding wreckage in unfamiliar water. I returned to limited duty once the inquiry closed without formal sanction, uncertain whether I had earned that mercy or simply been extended one I had not yet learned how to repay. I keep an unofficial file now, one no tribunal has requested. Passive surveillance confirms Tom Bridger is unchanged. He still fishes the same waters, still irritated rather than afraid when the same predator returns on what has become, by local joke, a predictable schedule. Still teaching younger fishermen the difference between nosy and hungry, with the same weary patience he has apparently offered for 20 years and counting. I do not fully understand what allows a species to work daily alongside genuine, lethal danger without either fear or recklessness claiming the decision for them. I have stopped needing to fully understand it in order to respect what it has quietly built across generations on that coastline. I do not look at my pressure scarring the way I once did. For 164 cycles it meant I have learned to fear the ocean correctly, and correct fear, renewed without fail, is what keeps a species like mine alive. I understand now it meant something smaller. I had learned to fear what could kill me. Tom Bridger had simply never agreed that fear was the only correct response available to something dangerous, and 40 years of evidence suggested he had been right not to agree. I do not know if I will encounter him again. My consultation has not authorized further contact, and I have not requested it, though the request remains drafted, unsent, in the same file as everything else about this world I have not yet closed. If it comes to that, if some future crisis brings me into range of a species my own doctrine still cannot fully classify, I have already decided what I will do. I am simply waiting for the moment someone asks it of me.